All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Cod Cabin, the Bay State's newest political podcast. I'm Jesse Hahn, joined by Adam Bass, Jack Leary, and Logan, and our first ever special guest, Mr. Alan Khazei, candidate for Congress in the 4th Congressional District. We're sitting down virtually tonight during rather turbulent few weeks in our country. We hope to address the many issues that are on the minds of our listeners, and most importantly, 4th District voters. So without further ado, welcome, Alan. We hope you and your family are doing well, and we'd like to invite you to introduce yourself to our audience.
Sure. Jesse, Adam, Logan, it's great to be with you all. Thank you for having me. I'm honored to be your first guest. My name is Alan Khazei. I'm the co-founder of City Year. It's a national service program that was the model for AmeriCorps, and I'm the candidate in the 4th Congressional District for Congress.
All right, jumping right into our first question. In recent weeks, activists nationwide have been encouraging Democratic candidates to sign on to the no cop money pledges to swear off donations from police unions. You signed on to the College Democrats of Massachusetts pledge today. Why did you sign on, and what do you think has to change when it comes to policing in our country?
Well, Jesse, yes, I was honored to sign on to that pledge, and thank you all for leading. It's always young people who lead big change. And look, we have to deal with 400 years of systemic racism. George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and literally thousands of others can't have died in vain. And what's inspiring to me is that young people and others, but young people at the forefront, hundreds of thousands of people have been peacefully protesting across our state, across our country, and even across the world. And I think it's larger. The issues, police conduct is very important. I mean, what happened to George Floyd is just horrific and just appalling. But we have to get at the larger systemic issues of race, which has been going on for 400 years in this country. So what I've called for is a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I had the chance to travel to South Africa in 1996, a year after it was launched. I then made multiple trips starting in 2001. I actually got to meet President Mandela, which is still one of the highlights of my life, and worked with South African leaders, including him, to launch City Year South Africa. So I think we need to have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission in this country where we can get the truth out. Now, really for the first time, many white people are being educated on what Black people have known for centuries, which is there is deep structural racism in our country. If we have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, we can start by telling the truth. We can educate people. Now, what happened with George Floyd is it was filmed by that brave young person. And so white people saw something, and in an encouraging way, people are responding, saying, wait a minute, this is not what we want our country to be. If we do that, we will get stories told. We have to understand the truth. That, I think, will then build the political will and a multiracial intersectional coalition for significant policy change. I think we need massive criminal justice reform. And I think we need national service at scale, because what I've learned through my service work is when young people come together from different backgrounds on the common ground of service, we understand our diversity is our strength. We actually deal with racism, and we build a more multicultural coalition. In terms of the police budgets, yes, we have to look at all budgets. We have to look at how we're spending our money. I think we need to move more funding into education, into communities, into job training, into service programs, into after-school programs, into more opportunities for young people, into social work. We have to look beyond just sort of a police budget. Similarly, nationally, we have to look beyond just a defense budget. We have to understand that our community's health, our people's health, all these things are important, and they're even more important. So I was happy to sign on to the pledge. You may know that 10 years ago, when I first ran for the Senate, I was among the very first congressional candidates in the country to say I wouldn't take any corporate PAC or lobbyist money. And I think this fits with that. But we also have to have a holistic approach and finally deal with the structural racism that's been at the heart of this country. As I've said, America was born with very high ideals, and it was forged in a revolution. It began with protest. But we have two original sins. The first being the genocide of the native people who lived here. And we're still seeing the effects of that today with unemployment on tribal communities. massively higher than the national average, for example. And the other original sin was slavery, which we wrote right into our Constitution until the Civil War and the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. We're still paying for those. We need to bring that out to the surface. We need to confront it with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And then we need massive criminal justice reform. In addition to allocating budgets properly and looking at what the police are getting, we need to end mass incarceration. We need to end the death penalty. We need to end private prisons. Talk about another appalling thing, people making money off of people in jail. We need to ban the box. We need to restore voting rights. We need to let prisoners have Pell Grants. We need to move from what is not a criminal, we don't have a criminal justice system right now. We have a criminal vengeance and retribution system. We need a much larger approach to deal. We have the biggest incarceration rate in the world. We should be ashamed of that. But 1 in 3 African-American men are in prison. I mean, so anyway, I was happy to sign on to your pledge, but I think we got to go much farther. And I've already laid on an agenda. And if I have the privilege of serving the 4th District, I will fight tooth and nail to get this done.
Absolutely. Thanks for that answer. I'm going to toss to Adam right now for his first question.
Thank you, Jesse. Alan, great to see you again. Thank you for joining us once more. So I had the chance to not only interview you, but a couple other candidates, Jesse Mermel, Ben Siegel, Jake Auchincloss, share similar beliefs with you. One candidate in particular who is now off the ballot, Nick Matthews, has said, and I quote, "My campaign was the antithesis of the Alan Khazei campaign. You're not a big funded lawyer that is putting profits over people." Now, obviously, this deserves a rebuttal from you or just a talk back from that. How do you respond to that, as well as for people who might, unfortunately, may think that and may not get to know you? So, in a sense, getting to know you better as a candidate and
Sure.
how you act with constituents.
Well, I've done forums with Nick. I've never heard him say that directly to my face. I've done, before he didn't make the ballot, we were together, and I actually admired his career as a teacher and his agenda. Just to correct the record, so I graduated law school with student debt. I started city year from scratch at a law school. I turned down corporate law jobs, which I could have taken. And in fact, many people told me, take those jobs, pay off your debt, and then start city year. So I don't know with the idea of big corporate law. I've never practiced a law a day in my life. I started right out of law school from scratch. I made, the first year I worked on city year, I made $12,000. And I did that because I was to get through law school, I worked. In addition to loans, I was a teaching fellow. And I was able to keep that. And thankfully, I was also a resident tutor advisor at the college. And honestly, they created a new position for me, public service tutor. They were supposed to kick me out, but they let me stay. So I got my room and board covered by that, and I basically paid my other bills by teaching. And so I don't know where this idea of big corporate law funded campaign. I've spent my whole life in public service. I spent 20 years at city year, growing it from scratch, 50 young people from all different backgrounds. Today, it's in 32 cities. It's across America. It's in the United Kingdom. It's in South Africa. We serve 200,000 kids a day. I've gone on to found multiple non-for-profits. I founded Be the Change. I've worked at Opportunity Nation, Voices for National Service, Service Year Alliance, Service Nation, Got Your Six. My latest is Democracy Entrepreneurs. So I'd love to see Nick, and actually, I don't know when he said that, but my record is, I'll put it in front of anybody's in terms of a commitment to public service, which I've been doing my entire life. And more importantly, I tried to, I've started at the grassroots. I try to stay connected to the grassroots. I believe you have to be proximate, as my friend Brian Stevenson, who really is the leader on criminal justice reform in our country. You have to understand change comes from the bottom up. I've also worked to pass 3 major pieces of federal legislation, working with both sides of the aisle, but in particular with Senator Kennedy, President Clinton, and President Obama. No one else in this race has any experience of actually getting legislation through the Congress. I did that not because of me, but because my approach has always been build a coalition, empower people, tap the movement energy like we're seeing, which is extraordinary right now, and focus that on getting change through Congress. And when Tom DeLay tried to kill the AmeriCorps program in 2003, he was the Mitch McConnell of his day. A lot of you folks won't remember Tom DeLay. You're too young. But he was the majority leader in the House. He was a very powerful man, just like Mitch McConnell, and he was really bad, just like Mitch McConnell. He tried to kill the AmeriCorps program, not because it was a bad program, but because it was Clinton's favorite program. So he said, after Clinton left office, I want to get rid of this. There was an 80% funding cut overnight. I organized a national movement, grassroots movement, to say, we got to stop this. And even though the Republicans had the entire federal government, the House, the Senate, and the White House, the coalition that I helped organize beat Tom DeLay. We did something unprecedented. We said, we're going to go to Washington and we're going to stay up all night for 5 days. We're going to keep testifying for over 100 hours. And that worked. And we went from an 80% funding cut to a 50% increase. We saved the Corporation for National Service, $1 billion agency. And as a result, more than 1.1 million people have done AmeriCorps. So I'll put that record up against anybody. I think I have the experience and the track record and actually show that all of us are good votes. Most of us are going to support the same things. But the question is, can you get it done? Can you point to any time in your record, in your experience, where you've actually done it? And I can point to that. And so I'll put that record up against Nick or anybody else.
All right, I'm going to turn it over to Logan for the next question. Logan?
Thank you. My question is, how do you think Charlie Baker has done in handling the coronavirus? And do you think we are reopening too quickly?
I think I like that Governor Baker is trying to rely on the science. I think we should be more aggressive. I think that we should, I've called for example, I think we should be much more aggressive on testing and on contact tracing. Now, look, Trump is the nightmare here, and he refuses to use the federal government, and pits the states against each other, which is just awful. But I do think that we have to make sure that we're safe. So I've called for 500,000 young people in national service immediately and 1 million within a year. We need 300,000 contact tracers. According to Johns Hopkins, we have about 10,000 in the country. So, but Massachusetts could lead the way. We could set up our own program, expand the service program that already exists, and say, and you know what? Young people are the best to do this, because sadly the coronavirus is attacking more young people, more people of color, not young people, but more low-income people, more people of color. And your generation, there's no majority race. So you're the natural generation to reach out to low-income people, people of color, because you got to gain their trust. It's all going to be done digitally, and you understand technology better than anyone. So we could be doing that. We could be doing more testing. So look, I'm not in the state government. I don't have all the facts. I think he's trying to do the best he can. But I think we have to balance safety with reopening. The real answer to reopening is doing the testing, doing the contact tracing, and then ultimately getting a vaccine. But I also think we have to be creative about how we're using our public policy. For example, in addition to calling for national service at scale, I called for something very early to save small businesses before the first stimulus package, called emergency wage support. And basically what I said was, don't make it a loan program through the banks. The real small businesses don't have the big banking relationships. They don't have the collateral. They can't risk. Most of them, their home, if they own a home, is their collateral. They can't put that at risk. And guess what? 95% of African-American owned businesses didn't get any PPP loans. 91% of Hispanic-owned businesses, a vast majority of women-owned businesses. I said, just give the money directly to keep people on their jobs rather than force them on unemployment. Again, I think that's something we could pilot here in Massachusetts. We could use unemployment insurance in a more creative way. There is a provision in the law that people can use up to their unemployment to pay wages up to 50%. I think we should be using that. So, I think we have to be very thoughtful about this. But, I really blame Trump as the most responsible person, because his whole approach is divide and conquer. What he did in response to George Floyd's horrific killing, when they're looting, shoot them. It's just awful. And he continues to do that. And the fact that he didn't mobilize the federal government to get the Defense Production Act, to produce the test, to do the contact tracing, to support our frontline workers with the personal protective equipment they need. is just, it's unforgivable. 120,000 people have died now unnecessarily. And 40 million people are out of work unnecessarily. Other countries are doing this much better. Germany, South Korea, France, United Kingdom. So that's where I really put the blame.
All right. Well, I think Jack is up next.
I want to return to national service for a minute because that seems like it's one of the core issues that you're building your campaign on, and it's really not an issue that a lot of other candidates across the country are talking about. And you've spent your whole life, your whole adult life, with City Year and other nonprofits advocating for national service. So I just want to ask, why is service so important to you, and what benefits do you think it'll bring if you can expand national service programs in Congress?
Sure, Jack, thank you. Well, I think we need two big fundamental changes to make our democracy work. One is we have to get the money out of politics, and we have to reform our democracy. We got to end partisan gerrymandering. We have to end lobbying. We have to ban corporate PAC money, et cetera. The other fundamental reform, I do think, is creating a new rite of passage where all young people would be challenged and inspired to give a year of service to our country. Because what it does is it has multiple benefits. First of all, it turns on what I've learned are people's justice nerves. By getting proximate, what that means is if you spend a year in national service and you're working on issues of injustice, working with kids in low-income schools, or working to build housing for the homeless, or to feed people who are struggling, or to environmental justice work, or doing disaster relief after terrible hurricanes or tornadoes, you realize, wow, I have power. I have efficacy. I can actually make a difference. I can use my talents. And once that justice nerve is turned on, and our studies have shown this, it doesn't turn off. It's a way to complete the civil rights movement. The reason Michael and I and others who started City Year started it in Boston is because Boston has had a terrible history with racial violence, because of the busing and the desegregation going back to the 70s. And I grew up during that time. And we thought, if we could show that this could work in Boston, and we could bring together people from Southie and Roxbury and Chelsea and Brookline and Newton and Wellesley, if we can make it work here, it can work anywhere. That's another advantage. Another advantage is that we have a lot of problems that if you can tap youthful energy to solve them, we've shown that City Year makes a big difference. When we're in a school, the scores of the students we work with go up by over a year. They gain a year in reading and math. We've shown that you can run after school programs for kids and keep them in a safe place, especially if they have a single mom or a single dad or two working parents. We've shown that we can we can be foot troops after natural disasters. There's evidence now. In fact, for every dollar spent, there's a $4 return. So we've learned that young people can solve big problems. So that's another advantage. Most of all, I think we need to regain our sense of common purpose as a country, that we're all in this together. And when you spend a year together from different backgrounds, you gain that. So I have been working on that. I think that so for my grandparents, maybe if your great-grandparents, we talk about the greatest generation. It's the generation of the 30s and the 40s, the Depression and World War II. I remember talking to my grandparents about this. The reason they were the greatest generation is because they all rallied together. They all served together. First of all, during the Depression, there was the Civilian Conservation Corps. People took care of each other. Remember my grandparents telling me they had a little corner store, and for people who couldn't afford to pay them, at the end of the day, they would just give out free food, because that's what people did to take. And then when the war happened, a lot of people went to war, but even on the home front, there were the rubber drives and the tin drives and Rosie the Riveter and women going to, there was a sense we're all in this together. If we had national service at scale, every generation, I believe, would become a greatest generation because they would have had that shared generational experience. Finally, what national service can do, if you have the reward system, which I've proposed, basically I'd like to see for every year of service, you get 2 years of higher education, public school tuition. So it'd be roughly $11,200. It'd be $22,400. Only I want to broaden it to the American dream. So can you use that? It's sort of like the GI Bill after World War II. You could use it to pay for higher education. The average student loan debt is around $30,000. So if you did 1 year of service, you would graduate, with a tiny debt that you could manage. Or you could use the money for a down payment on a home, your first home. Or if you don't want to go to college, and not everybody does, you could use it for job training or an apprenticeship program. I also think you should be able to use it if you want to be a small business or nonprofit entrepreneur and start your own thing. So if you did 2 years of service, you'd have an American Dream account of almost $43,000. So it's also a way to jumpstart your generation on the American Dream. So for me, it's a win-win-win. Studies show that it works. Young people who do national, 94% of them are registered to vote. 93% of them say that they feel more comfortable making friends with people from fundamentally different backgrounds because they've done it. 80% say that given a community problem, they believe they could rally the community, including a diverse group of people, to solve it. So that's why I've fought for this my whole life. And I actually believe now, given this moment, the healthcare crisis from COVID, the economic crisis, and now the race crisis, is the time to put national service. I'd like to see 1 million people within a year and then even go further. It's, because you can put people to work, you can solve these problems, and you can deal with the structural racism. And actually, I believe I can get it done because I have worked on this. If I have the privilege of getting elected to serve the 4th District, I will get this done. As I mentioned, I did 3 bills as a citizen. If I'm actually in the Congress, working it, I believe I can rally the coalition to actually get this done, and we could have 1 million people in service within a year. That's
definitely a bold vision, Alan. I think we have time for a few more questions, so I'll pass it back to Jesse.
Yep. We're going to have a lightning round.
Sure.
You can say a few sentences on the question, and
sure,
that'll be fine. Boston City Councilor Michelle Wu and Newton City Councilor Jake Auchincloss, who's obviously running in the 4th District too, have proposed that the MBTA should be free for the sake of equity and climate justice. You have bold plans of your own on the issue of transportation, and I'd like for you to talk about that. But do you think free service should be a goal for the T?
I think we should have subsidized service. I think it should be free for certain people. Look, I ride the T a lot. It needs massive overhaul. I live near the Green Line. Pre-COVID, I would ride it all the time. I don't think I should have free T service. I can afford it. And somehow you got to pay for it. It's expensive. We need to do a massive overhaul. It's over 100 years old. But for students, for low-income people, for people who can't afford it, yes, I do think it should be free because it's essential for people to get to work. Look, we were able to get the state to provide free T passes for city year core members because we said, look, they're serving the community. They need the T or the bus system, the public, to get around to the service projects. That makes sense to me. So I think for certain categories of people, low-income people, students, and others, yes, absolutely. But frankly, for people like me who can afford a T pass, no, because somehow you got to pay for it. And not only we have to pay for the T as it is, we got to have a massive overhaul. I'll tell you, if I'm elected to Congress, there's going to be an opportunity for a big infrastructure bill, and I'm going to fight to make sure that's around public transportation because we have to modernize the T. And so that's what I would be for.
Yeah. I know a lot of friends of mine who'd be really happy with that. I'll toss it to Adam for the next question.
Yes. So going back to the election as a whole, there was a poll released by Becky Grossman showing you in 4th place. Jesse Mermel has gotten an endorsement from NEIU or SEIU, pardon me. So my question is, to put it bluntly, how do you make people crazy about Khazei?
Well, it's by having these kind of conversations. So first of all, Becky's own poll, and that was her poll, showed 60% of people are undecided. And I think it's at least 60%. The truth is, between the presidential campaign and then COVID and now this extraordinary response on race, nobody's really tuned into this race yet. There's been very little attention to it. I feel really good about where I am in the race. And so I think, and I'm proud of the support I've gotten. Senator Mark Pacheco has endorsed me. The Dean of the Senate, the longest serving representative, and from Taunton, the 5th biggest city in the district. Representative Jeff Roy's endorsed me, again, from Franklin, a superstar public servant. I've also gotten big national, Susan Rice, who is on Vice President Biden's list to potentially be his running mate, is supporting me. Congressman Jamie Raskin, who in only his third term has emerged as a progressive leader. He's a role model for me. He's supporting me. Mitch Landrieu's supporting me. Bruce Reed, who was Vice President Biden's chief of staff in the White House, is supporting me. Michelle Flournoy, who will likely be the first woman Secretary of Defense, is supporting me. Holly Ryan, who I'm most proud of. She serves on the city council with Jake and Becky, but with all the candidates. She endorsed me because she said historically that this seat, Barney Frank, Joe Kennedy, there's been a person who's a champion for the LGBTQ plus community, and that she's looked at my record of fighting for intersectional coalitions and fighting for the most vulnerable people. Honestly, out of all the endorsements, that's the one I'm the most proud of, because she said, my community's lives are at risk and we need somebody who will protect us. So she's supporting me, which out of all of them, that's why I'm still the most proud of it. It brought tears to my eyes when I read what she wrote. And she's not only a city councilor, she's a national leader in the LGBTQ plus community for decades. So, I'm getting support from people. And most importantly, as I'm out there through Zoom, as I'm talking to people, as we're making phone calls, I'm finding that people are recognizing now that it's not just enough to say you're going to cast the right votes. Do you have a strategy and a record of actually getting it done? And again, I think I can point to a record of getting it done that's different from any other candidates.
Logan, you're up.
Right. I was reading a little bit about your support of charter schools in the 2010 Senate election. You wanted things like doubling charter school investment and removing the state cap on charter schools. I was wondering if you still support those policies now.
Well, so Logan, I'm glad you asked that. So look, I've spent most of my life working with inner city communities in public education, and I saw that there are some good charter schools where it's the only option for low-income people to get a good education, and there's big waiting lists. So my view is charter schools have to be held accountable, just as public schools do. I am concerned about the diversion of funds. I think we need to make sure that we are funding public education, frankly, not the way we do it now, which is based with property taxes, so that Brookline does well, but then other low-income communities like Taunton don't have the same tax base, so they don't have as much per student. And so I am concerned about that. I think we have to look at it. I think that the charters that don't work need to be defunded and dechartered. I mean, their charters should be taken away. But there are some charters that work. I know, for example, the Academy of the Pacific Rim is a very successful charter school. It's now led by a city or alumni, and it has a big wait list. So I think we have to look at it case by case. I think the schools have to be accountable. I am not for-profit charter schools. I think that's, just like we should get rid of private prisons, I don't think we should have for-profit charter schools. In some cases, they do work. But I do think we have to look at the funding. As far as, I do think it is a different time. It's 10 years later. But there are some charter schools that work, especially for low-income kids that don't have other opportunities. I think ultimately, but it's still a very small number, ultimately what I'm for is we have to have a much bigger investment in public education, starting with our teachers. I think that teachers, what we're seeing from this coronavirus is essential workers. Who are our essential workers? Well, our nurses are essential workers. Our grocery store clerks are essential workers. Our sanitation workers are essential workers. Our public health workers are essential. And our teachers who have pivoted to try to provide online. Our teachers are among the lowest paid. If you look at other professions, being a lawyer, a doctor, an architect, certainly somebody in finance, teachers make much less. I think that we should get to a place where being a teacher is among the highest paid professions, so that you can be a teacher, you can get the American dream yourself. You can afford to buy a home, you can afford to send your kids to college, you can have a secure retirement. I would like to see teachers' salaries get to 6 figures. And so that, and I would like to encourage people to understand, if you go into teaching, you're going to be revered. All of us I know after my parents, it was my teachers, my public school teachers had the biggest impact on me. And I'm sure if I had a chance to ask each one of you, you could tell me at least one or two teachers that literally changed your life. We need to spend much more on our teachers because they're the leaders in the schools. And we have to have a bigger commitment to public education. And we have to change how we fund public education so we don't have this inequity. You know, if you live in Wellesley or Newton or Brookline, you have a great tax base. But if you're in Taunton or Fall River, you don't. That has to change. So that's what I would emphasize.
Great. Well, Jack is up next.
I think this will be our last question. To my knowledge, every candidate in this district running right now is from the northern part of the district, particularly Brookline, where you live, Wellesley, and Newton. How does your campaign plan on doing outreach to communities in the southern part of the district, like Fall River and Taunton, and how will you support these communities specifically in Congress?
Thank you, Jack. It's a great question. So you're right. That's why I've spent a lot of time in the southern part of the district. I'm honored that Senator Pacheco chose me out of all the candidates. He's the Dean of the Senate from Taunton. Jeff Roy from Franklin is supporting me. But and also my own background. So I'm the child of immigrants. My father was an immigrant from Iran, left a country of dictatorship for a country of freedom, raised me to believe that the reason he came here was because of our ideals of liberty, equality of opportunity, democracy, and most of all, justice for all. And he taught me when we go against our ideals, like overthrowing Mossadegh, the popular elected prime minister of Iran, or not supporting Mandela, we always run into trouble and it always comes back to haunt us. My father's family is now banned from this country because of the evil person in the White House. So it's personal for me. I think if my dad served 20,000 people as a doctor, saved a lot of lives, and was a great public servant. My mother was Italian. She was a nurse. My Italian family settled in Western Pennsylvania. My great-grandfather was a coal miner. Most of my Italian family is still working class people. And so and where I was born in Pittsburgh, and then where I lived the first year was in Katanning, is much like Fall River and Taunton. They were industrial cities, good jobs, good middle-class communities because of the coal mines, the factories, the steel mills. They're all gone. The opioid crisis is huge in Katanning, just like it is in Fall River. The industrial base is gone, and it hasn't been brought into the 21st century economy. So here's what I'm going to do if I get elected. A, I can understand it because it's literally my family in Katanning and Ford City. B, I have a strategy. So Paul Tsongas, who was a mentor of mine, he was one of the founding board members of City Year, and I learned a lot from him. One of the things he did, he got elected to Congress from Lowell. And one of the first things he did was he realized as a congressperson, he had convening power and he could get federal money. And so he brought together the leaders in Lowell. He brought together the business leaders, the nonprofit leaders, the higher ed leaders, and state and local government leaders. He said, look, I don't have all the answers, but collectively, he also brought labor to the table. He said, if we work together, those of us in this room and the people we represent, we can come up with a strategy to turn Lowell around. I'll meet with you every month and I'll do my part. I'll get federal money. Because if you're tenacious enough, you can get federal money, and he did. But the state and local government had to do their part. The business community had to do their part. The nonprofit community that had the grassroots community did their part. UMass Lowell has now become, thanks to Tsongas' leadership, one of the pillars in our public higher institutions. And there's the Tsongas Arena named for him because he led the turnaround. Usually you think it's a mayor or a governor to do that. I'm going to do exactly the same thing for the southern part of this district, for Taunton and Fall River. I've already talked to Mark about it. Part of the reason he endorsed me was because I have the strategy. And he has a lot of good ideas, but we also need federal money. I've talked to Mayor Coogan about it in Fall River. I've talked to other leaders. I will be putting together a plan for the district, but in particular for the southern part of the district that needs to be brought into the 21st century economy. I have a strategy, and I've done it before. I built City Year on a public-private partnership, bringing together the best of state government, federal government, local government, private sector, philanthropy, and the nonprofit community, and public education. So that's my appeal to people. And you'll see it. I will produce a plan. People will know exactly what I'm going to do. I'm working on a plan now for all 34 cities and towns because I want to be ready. I think the last thing I'll say is I believe we're in a new Deal period. Because of these multiple crises now, the healthcare crisis, economic, and now race, there's going to be a sense of urgency, and God willing, Biden has to win. we are going to have to deal with this horrendous mess that Trump has left us with. But in crisis, there's opportunity. I believe that there will be another 100 or 200-day opportunity. I think there's going to be a chance to get national service to 1 million people. I think there's going to be a chance to do creative things around small business. And I think there's going to be a chance for big infrastructure, Green New Deal, healthcare for everyone. And there's going to be a chance to do the kind of economic development that I want to do as a model that could be replicated. So I'm using the campaign to get ready, because I want to be ready on day one to say, okay, here's a piece of legislation. Let's get an economic plan for Taunton and Fall River. So that's what how I'm appealing to people and working to be ready.
Right. Alan, thanks for joining us. We're running a little bit short on time, so I'm going to cut it off right here.
All right.
Later this week, we'll be joined by Dave Cavell and Ben Siegel. And if you have the opportunity of being elected to Congress, we'd love to have you back.
I'll be back. Look, I'll just end with this, Jesse. I so appreciate you guys doing this. I'm honored to have been your first guest. It's always young people who are on the forefront of change. We're seeing it right now. You can go back to the abolitionist movement, the suffragist movement, Alice Paul, 26 years old. You can go to the students who did the sit-ins during the civil rights movement and the voter registration drives, the marches. You can go to the LGBTQ plus movement, the environmental movement, Sunrise, March for Our Lives. It's your generation that's going to lead this country to where we need to be. So
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
All right.
Thank you, Alan.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
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 Bye.